You're listening to Inflow and On Fire, your weekly podcast companion for finding your flow and stoking your inner fire. I'm your host, Quinn Curtis, artist, mother of 5, and aspiring children's book author illustrator. Every month, our soulful discussions spark from a relevant fairy tale or myth. These help us better understand how to navigate our inner worlds and everyday lives so that we can live more joyfully, bring those big and beautiful dreams to life, and make the world a better place. Want to get the most out of this episode? Well, be sure to snag the free gorgeous study guide in the show notes that includes a written copy of the fairy tale or myth, soulful journaling questions, and other additional juicy resources. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming back. I'm so excited to talk Bluebeard with you today.
Thanks for having me. This is I don't know that it's one of my favorites, but it's definitely been one of the most impactful myths for me in my life. So it's fun to get to talk about it with somebody because I feel like it's one of those things where you probably have your own thing that sticks with you your whole life, but you're not really there's not often an opportunity to sit down with somebody and be like, have you been thinking about this for your whole life the way that I have? So thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, of course. Yeah. I think that, it's funny as I've been telling people, we're talking about fairy tales and myths on the podcast. I get really interesting reactions sometimes of some people are like, well, I just don't really like myths and fairy tales. And, and that response always shocks me because I think that our lives, our sense of reality, our sense of navigating the world, so much of it comes from myths and fairy tales, even if we're not aware that it was specifically called that. So whether that's religious myths and fairy tales or even cultural myths and fairy tales of just even the types of things that one society values over another are largely based off of the stories that are happening in that culture. So the story of Bluebeard is kind of fascinating because I don't know that this crossed over the ocean as much as a lot of the European tales. But I feel like a lot of Europeans, if you grew up in any part of Europe or Russia, you've heard this tale. This is a lot more familiar to you, which is fascinating in and of itself.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I think maybe one person, and it might be just you, but maybe one person in my life has ever been like Bluebeard. And I think the majority of people who I've talked to who are familiar with this do come through Clarissa Pinkola Estes' Women Who Dance with the Wolves, which is great. But it's not like a cultural knowing in American culture, I don't think.
No, it's not, but it is such an important tale. And it feels like in fact, one of the other guests that I interviewed for this series, I didn't give her any forewarning. I was just just go read the Myth of Bluebeard. And she was talking about how it was really haunting. It took her back. I think that our first time hearing this story will always feel like that, where it makes an impression. So I would love to talk about your experience with it as well in our discussion, but I was fascinated that you read this, wasn't it when you were pretty young, right? Was your first encounter?
Yeah. So kudos to the library for being a space that just allows you to happen upon books. And I happened upon Women Who Run with the Wolves when I was probably 14 at the library. And
which I'm just dying because we were friends back then. Why weren't you sharing this goodness? You just had so much goodness. It was probably hard to share it all.
Well, it was one of those things where I took it home, and a lot of it was probably a little bit over my head at the time. I found myself really appreciating the myths and the storytells a lot more than the analyses and the psychoanalyses. I didn't have a lot of the understanding that I have now about Jung or, any of these other things that she's drawing on. But I remember very clearly reading to myself this Bluebeard myth and feeling like I was trespassing. I was trespassing in an adult world. It was very, very scary and intense. And kind of in the way that maybe like a kid doesn't say, hey, I watched a scary movie. I was
Mm.
kind of like, oh, okay, I'm gonna like stuff this down and keep this knowing to myself. But it's amazing how over the years, growing up and doing the work that I do and being involved in, obviously sexual violence work, so many times this myth has come up in my life around intuition and guts and understanding oneself and trusting oneself and the power of female friendship. Like all of these things have really just played out so many times, and I think it's something that I've come back to thousands of times throughout my life. So even though it was a little early, maybe for
First
the myth,
exposure.
I never forgot it, and I went back and read this myth many many times in the course of the last 25 years or so.
Wow. And I love what you're bringing in with the connection to the work that you do and how it just keeps coming. I think this is one of the reasons why I feel like myths and fairy tales stories are so important, because a myth can say it better usually. Like to just say like, they trusted this guy and they didn't listen to their intuition. It hits different than when you're like, ooh, they were in a Bluebeard situation. Then
Yeah.
if you've heard or felt that story, it hits really different and you understand it on like a soul level, maybe even, or just, I love that about it.
I think that that's such an important point. I feel like if we think about these myths as things that have been distilled and distilled and distilled over hundreds and hundreds of years, you get to this core piece so quickly with a myth in a way that a typical story, too many words, right? There's too much. So distilling it down to its very essence is, I think, a lot of what these myths are really at. And that is what allows them to be so accessible at like this dark, deeper level, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, and the season of Samhain and October is such a really good time for us to kind of look at those inner demons or the skeletons in the closet and make peace with them and move or move away from them. So I love that we're getting to talk about this right now. What specifically, like, I'd love to hear more actually if you're up for sharing, but just like, how do you see this myth playing out? Like, we're kind of looking at it at a high level, but maybe has there been a specific instance in your life or a specific situation where you're like, wow, this really hits with this myth, and the myth maybe even helped you untangle the situation?
Yeah, I think there's so many levels that this particular myth works at. But one of the biggest take homes for me has been the feeling of needing to listen to yourself. And that sometimes that initial feeling that something is wrong, something is not okay, our willingness to put that aside or rationalize it away is something that I think is really common, and really you can see it play out in a lot of people's lives. And I'm no exception to that. There's a lot of times where you would meet somebody and something about them would not resonate with, like something about them would say, this isn't feeling good. This isn't feeling right. But for whatever reason, whether it's societal pressure or the pressure that's on all women to be nice and kind,
Mm.
and, put on a smile.
Smile more. Yeah.
Yeah. You get to this place where you rationalize away your instincts. And I think that lack of self-trust and self-belief is kind of where I've seen this play out most, both in my life and also, in culturally as I've talked to folks. And that's not I think one thing that Bluebeard kind of is it's interesting because I think back in the day, in like the 17th century or whenever they made this into an opera, I feel like the message was like, stop asking questions, you nosy ladies. Like, I think it was a cautionary tale.
Don't get too
Yeah.
curious.
And so I think it's straddling this border of, if you're not careful, you can turn it into like a, you know, it's your fault that you're in this situation, rather than a
Wow.
look at the forces that are at play that push people into ignoring their own instincts, right? Like in the Bluebeard
Mm.
tale, you have the thing that pushes this woman over is that party, right? So Bluebeard hosts this big party,
Mm.
and they have like this, and not only does she go, but her sisters go, and her mom goes, and in some of the other fairy tale tellings, like her friends go, and
Mm.
like they have this awesome time, and they're chatting and they're talking, and they're all digesting this all together, and they all collectively are like, maybe we were wrong. And I think
Wow.
that is such a powerful thing too, because
Wow.
again, these like self knowings and the way that we kind of shut ourselves down, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of times we're reaching out, we're trying to assess the situation, we're feeling things as well as we can and saying like, am I right? Is that creepy? Is that right? Is that wrong? Like,
Mhm.
and there's something that is a knowing, right? That kind of that that can kind of get lost once lots of voices start to weigh in, right?
Wow.
So I
Yeah.
think that's kind of where I've seen it play out the most.
Dang, I love that connection. I think that at least in the version of that we've shared in the podcast from Women Who Run with the Wolves, that party aspect is not it's not emphasized, it's not present. So I love that you're bringing that forward as like that is a huge time where we're like, am I being crazy? And they're like, yeah, you're being really over protective or you're being really sensitive, And so then you're like, yeah, I probably am. And you then push
Mm-hmm.
down the knowing, like you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
versus, gosh, why it's so important to have even just one person in your life that represents your greatest good, or will
Mm-hmm.
stand up for it. Because I think a lot of times the sources that we're reaching out to or checking in with sometimes, especially as women, where it's like whatever women are around, aren't always safe places, right? And they don't always have our best interests. And so they might be encouraging us how to play the game and how to win in the Bluebeard situation versus like, and win meaning like how to get the guy, how to get the
Yeah.
house, right?
Yeah.
Instead of like how to actually live and be in an environment where you feel supported and safe and can be yourself or can not feel like there's always something you're having to dance around or hide from.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this young girl's decision here is a mixing of understandings of what security means, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
Bluebeard to all the sisters initially feels fundamentally not secure, right? He feels dangerous. They don't like him. They don't know really why, but he's off putting. Something doesn't feel right. But then his wealth and his seeming like status and all of these
Mm-hmm.
things start playing into this idea of like, oh, this he's a little eccentric, but under this guise of eccentricity, maybe there's a huge layer of security that I could have. And obviously understanding like back in the day that security was absolutely everything to people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
being interested in trading that for one for the other, right? I'll trade my psychological security for my physical security here and making that judgment
Wow.
call, right? And I think a lot of times I don't I don't think that that's necessarily the dynamic that we have now, where people are like, oh, I better meet somebody who makes enough money. But there
Yeah.
is this idea of status and how someone presents to the world. Like there's a whole reason that we have somebody who's good on paper, right? That whole phrase exists
Mm-hmm.
for a reason. And I think that psychological security versus that status or security, physical security kind of playing off of each other is where it's really easy for people to go awry and talk themselves out of what their original feelings were.
Wow. It's just, you're making me think of just even, women's history. It's not been that long that we've had the freedoms and ability. I mean, goodness, even to just be able to have a credit card without having someone sign for you is like as of the past 50 years, right?
Right.
So, or less. So it is, I love what you're bringing forward about just even how the story probably did start as a cautionary tale. I can see that being the motive, where like women getting married into situations where it's like, yeah, if he says don't open that door, don't open that door. Like, keep yourself safe. Look at this girl. She nearly died,
Yeah.
And really recognizing, I think the emotional and psychological weight and trauma of those prior generations that still kind of haunts us as women and affects us now when we're living in a different world, I think is no small thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. There's also a bit of, Eve and the apple in this story, right? And like it's kind of a replay.
That's true. Wow.
Like you gotta you have this thing that you can't do. Don't eat that apple. Like, don't open that door. Don't do this thing. And yet the woman does, right? And obviously, in the same way that feminism has, in a lot of ways, reclaimed Eve, I think reclaiming this protagonist in the Bluebeard myth is also similarly important. Like, it's okay to ask a question. It's okay to want to know why. If you're paired with somebody, it's okay to probe into that background and be willing to look into that darkness to see what you need to see to get the information you need for yourself. I think that's an important consideration now that probably is unintentional, maybe.
You're so right. I mean, it's such a different world, and it's a really interesting time, right? Because especially here in the United States, where we have like this push for women to kind of go back to where we were without as many rights and freedoms.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Handmaid's Tale situations, like, and yeah, trad wives, like you're saying, like there's such a movement towards, well, it's the world works better when the men are in charge of everything, and you just do what they say, and you don't ask the questions, and you don't do the things, which is such a surprising resurgence in some ways, but also like not in other ways, because life is complex and stressful, and sometimes it does seem easier to just follow directions and just don't open that door, right? I think that's why a lot of us don't open that door with even just things that we believe we can't do.
Right. Absolutely.
Like, I think there's all sorts of self-imposed limitations. So when I heard this story, it was like 10 years ago, I think was the first time when I read it. I just wasn't ready for Women Who Run with the Wolves when you had it. So it found me much later, but I'm so glad it found me. It's a full circle, because here we are back to connecting on it. But it was permission giving for me. It helped me recognize that part of myself that would listen to others or would just do it on its own, of like sabotaging myself and holding myself back. Like, it was such a chilling tale for me to feel like my dreams are in that little cupboard, that dungeon, that my hopes and what I thought could be possible for my life. At the time when I read it, I was still in a very religious space where I had made certain decisions to create like my security. Like, I'm going to do all the things, and that's going to make it so God takes care of me. And so the church and my husband, everybody's good with me, right? Like, I believed that I didn't really have certain choices. So I think like Bluebeard was so profound to me because it helped me recognize the wrongness in like taking those hopes and dreams and like putting them in the cellar, even like myself, to like shut them out, shut them down, And so it really woke me up to that inner predator, especially in myself, that colludes with these outer predators that could, say, oh, that doesn't really matter. You're just being selfish and you don't really need that. And whatever justifications, like I love that phrase that you use, the justifications that help us ignore our instincts and lose our instincts, I think is even what you were saying, like lose touch with them, right? So ever since hearing this story, it's been very much a path of like reclaiming just like listening to myself again, right? Which has taken years to kind of build up that courage again and build up that strength. I don't know. It was wild.
Yeah, and I mean, I think every single person, if they're honestly giving themselves a review, can see the times where even just acknowledging, even just saying something isn't right, then creates a bloody key situation where you might try to put it back in the box, but once it's been said or thought or realized, you just can't, right? That's the situation where you're like, oh my gosh, I see this thing now that I can't unsee. And even if I try to bury it or put it away or, shut it down as much as I can, I can't, right? It keeps bleeding and bleeding and bleeding. And eventually people are like, why are you covered in blood? And you're like, I can't unsee or stop this thing. And it's sometimes those big truths just force themselves. Like once you see them, you cannot unsee them.
Thank you for bringing that forward. I think that's such an important point. I know that in my journey out of organized religion, it was a bleeding key scenario.
Yes. Same.
Yeah. Like I cannot unsee this. I am covered in blood right now.
Yes. Yeah. And you're almost unable to function in the normal scenarios because you might be talking to somebody with a straight face, but all they're doing is watching your bloody dress. They're like, I want to stop you right there. Have you noticed that you're bleeding everywhere? Like, can we not focus on the bleeding? Yes. Let's go back to the way things were. Don't focus on the fact that I'm, tripping all over myself and having all of these reactions and like it. Leaving religion is a great example of that because once you see it, you can't unsee it, or at least I couldn't unsee it. And there is at least for me, there was a time period where I wished I could unsee it, right?
Absolutely.
I wished I could put it back. Instead, eventually you have to confront what you've been not facing because your psyche legit won't allow you to not see it anymore. So
it's such an important point. Like I love that you're bringing that forward. I know you and I have shared over the holiday season, especially, is a hard time without religion, especially when you were born, like in your formative years, those traditions and aspects were the community aspect, right? Were such a part of what those holidays meant. And then you kind of have to rebuild. And so I really love that we're talking about this and going here because this is one of the reasons why we don't open the cupboard. Because I think instinctually we know once we see it, we won't be able to unsee it and things will have to change.
Right.
So for example, my daughter with her boyfriend recently, it was a really ugly situation and she ended up needing to dump him. And it has been hard since then. He's moved on. He's got all sorts of other girls. She's watching it all unfold from the sidelines. She hasn't just found her thing. She's in this space of the in-between and the grieving and figuring things out. And it is not comfortable. And there's a part of her that wishes she could just go back to being in that relationship, even though it was not a healthy relationship for her.
Well, and I think one of the things that's really key with this myth, puns, one of the things that's really key with this particular myth is it doesn't look like stuff's going to work out okay for her. She almost dies. Like it is not a situation where, she's going to be fine. And we never at any point, from the minute she finds the key or she opens that door, until the minute Bluebeard's dead, which is where the myth always ends. Like there's no denouement. I guess there's a little bit of a denouement in some of them where she inherits his estate, and like they give like a one sentence follow up to what happens to her. But essentially, for most of the myth, it ends with his death. And we never get that feeling of relief, right? It's never like she just survived, but barely. Like she almost just had her head chopped off by her psychopathic husband. So there's a lot of uncertainty in this process of self-discovery. There's not an assurance that everything is going to be fine. And in fact, once the key's kind of there and bleeding, you're in a danger zone, right? You have to like move through it until it's over. And there's no assurances that things are going to work out all right. And a lot of times, obviously, they are, because this is the catalyst for you to move to a better place, to more knowing, to more trust, etc. But it's not a sure thing. And it certainly doesn't feel sure when it's happening, when you're in that moment of terror, panic, uncertainty, watching yourself and your life kind of devolve, not knowing if you're going to make it through. This is not a fun space to be in, even if it's critical. So I think, every time we're in these really like bleeding key spaces, they're not fun spaces for us to be in. We'll likely survive, particularly if we've got support systems like her sisters and her brothers to, to fill those spaces, to come and support us. But it's not a sure thing. And it's certainly not a fun thing to watch your life, your status, your ideas about things crumble into this kind of moment.
Yeah. And to think too, like if the story were to continue and if this was like more literal, the amount of trauma that she just survived and has seen and witnessed will haunt her for a while. And like it doesn't make it so she can trust easily again.
Yeah. And there's a certain amount of cleanup she'd have to do. And I'm not talking about physical cleanup, but this person murdered lots of women, and their bodies are rotting in the cellar. And part of making oneself whole in this space would be to account for that, right? You would have to go exhume those bodies, contact the families, talk to them. And in a metaphorical way, you also have a lot of work to do when you exhume those parts of yourself. You have to take them out. You have to look at them. You have to like figure out where they go. You have to make right what's been wrong. It's not a small matter of like, oh, he's dead, everything's great. No, you have a bloody dungeon in the basement.
Yeah, and even if you do get the estate, like, gosh, do you want it,
Right.
Live in the place where all these murders happened. Every woman's dream, No. Oh, God, yeah. It's, it's just making me think of the phrase that dreams don't die, they're buried alive.
Yeah.
Right? It's been very real in my life of like, as you're talking about exhuming the bodies, it was just reminding me of I always, from the time I was tiny, wanted to be a ballerina and a dancer. And my parents would never let me, not even I asked time and time again for, all the way through even like 4th and 5th grade, I was asking. Aww. It was most of my childhood. That was the hope and the wish of my heart. Right. And they just kept never agreeing. Even when a ballet studio owner moved next door and offered to give us a discount and even give me rides, it was still a no. So it was just like this part that I had to let die. I had to put in that basement. And so as an adult trying to understand it, knowing what to do with the body, you know, of this like
Yeah.
dead dancing dream
Yeah.
of just needing to, I did have to go and look at that. And so I even like enrolled in an adult ballet class, and I bought a leotard and tights at like, I don't know, I was in my 30s when this was happening and had little kids at the time. And went to a few classes and just did a ton of research of like, okay, is this a dream that could be realized? What do I do with it? You know? And so it was
Yeah.
really an important time to face it. And ultimately I decided, although I second guess that decision every 5 years or so, but like that it wasn't something I want to pursue per se, that like this lifetime, just for whatever reason, isn't my ballerina lifetime. But that like what's at the heart of that dream, or what's underneath it, is maybe this desire to feel graceful and to feel strong and healthy and to be able to dance more. And so then I'm looking at like, okay, what kind of ways can we reintegrate those parts into our life right now? But the truth is that, at least that I've come to recognize, that was a huge part of that ballet story for me, was that some dreams really you hit a too late point on. And so this Bluebeard aspect of us, this part of us that wants to, like, that's just too scared to act on some of the things that we really want to do and create in our lives, like it's really awakened me to the cost of that, and how you literally do run out of time, quote unquote, with some of those dreams and hopes. And so I'm hopeful that this, like, I'm having this conversation with you, even feeling more inspired to be like, yes, I'm going to lean into some of these dreams that I'm working on. And I'm not going to keep justifying that I don't have time, or I should be cleaning the house, or, you know, the ways that we get ourselves out of it. I want to prioritize them.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And again, the ways that we shut ourselves down, that we play that predator, is so apparent there, and I totally resonates. I think it's really, in my life, you know, I always use jealousy or envy as such a good indicator for where I've buried the bodies.
Yes. So such a good tip. Yes.
if
Say
you're
more.
if you know, looking through your life and feeling that that is such a good, that's like my number one indication that I've buried some dream or some body somewhere. Because if I'm feeling envious or angry or, you know, jealous, something's under there. Again, not related to whatever that person's doing. It's related to a dream of mine that I am not living, or I'm not being true to, or it's something else. And so it's just such a great excuse to go digging for that thing to uncover and say, okay, well, this is where I'm not being met, right? This is where I'm leaving something behind, or I've locked something away, and I need to uncover it and look at it in real, truthful space.
It's a big, we're just all taking a deep breath here, because this is a big discussion. Man, well, I would love to even explore a little bit too of like why, like, we've talked about some of the reasons why we let this happen, but like I do think some of the times when we're burying these dreams, you know, it's probably a little bit like a pirate, as far as like, I'm going to take this treasure, I'm going to put it in this spot, and I'll come back. I'll get you. Like, don't worry, I'll be back. You know, I mean, obviously in Bluebeard's scenario, that would be harder because they were fully dead. But I think that there are good reasons why we bury those dreams and why we shift things. Because I think like part of Earth might be, this is me just thinking aloud, but my current philosophy in this moment feels like, you know, it's not necessarily realistic for all the fantasies to come true. But that's something I've had to really recognize in my life too, is the difference between a fantasy and a dream. And I feel like a dream, at least in the way I'm feeling it right now, a dream is like something more core to like a need, a soul need, or a like something that's going to fill you or fulfill you, versus a fantasy, which is like where we kind of get into the, well, you can't have everything you want kind of a zone. I don't know. Are you feeling that difference with me, or what comes to mind for you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, one of the things about this myth that really comes up for me with this idea of dreams is there's a certain amount of vulnerability with a dream versus a fantasy. In a fantasy,
Mm,
things happen to you, right?
yeah.
In my fantasy, somebody cleans my house and I get to travel. Like, in a dream, it's a dream about something coming alive in you, right? Something coming
Wow.
because of you. And I think there's vulnerability in dreams, and maybe they're more subject to self cruelty, right? So
Hmm.
if somebody does ask you why, or if somebody does kind of push you, sometimes it can get a little bit more, we can be more likely to push things down, right? So that they're less vulnerable, so that nobody sees that thing. Versus a fantasy, it's an easy thing to say, oh yeah, it's just a fantasy, like it's just an idea. There's no vulnerability in a fantasy
Hmm.
versus a dream, and I think that's why there's a higher likelihood of killing dreams, or shoving them down somewhere, or not taking advantage of the time when you have them. They're more close to your core and more easily wounded, I think.
Boy, this feels like we could, this is why we did this episode. I feel like this for me, like if we were doing this podcast just for me, like that's what I needed to hear today. Like this distinction between fantasy and dream, and what you're pointing about there being no vulnerability within a fantasy. You're so right. That really is the difference. It's like the fantasy isn't really asking anything of you. But the dream, it's kind of like that quote in the book of St. Thomas, where it's like, if you don't bring forth what is within you, it will kill you.
Correct. That's exactly. I think that's so in keeping with this slice of this myth. So true.
And also a part of that quote is that if you bring forth what's within you, it will save you.
Hmm.
Right. So you've got this dichotomy of it will save you or it will kill you. Right. And it feels like, yeah, there is that, as you're describing, even just that predator aspect, it feels like that self protection kind of gone wrong, right? Where the self,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just an interesting element in us. Like, why isn't it our cheerleader, right? Why isn't it hoping that we just go do all the things? Because it's like, that's dangerous, right? That there's a lot of risk.
Well, and also, again, if we go back to this idea of trading psychological for physical security, that also plays into dreams, right? A lot of
Wow.
times, what dreams ask us to do is to protect that psychological security, but maybe it's not super physically secure to do that, right? You're putting yourself out there.
Yep.
You're, maybe putting your livelihood in some sort of risk situation. A lot of times dreams are the things that require you to put yourself in a situation that's not necessarily physically safe in the pursuit of something that psychologically fills you. And how easy it is for people to talk you out of psychological safety in pursuit of some of these more concrete securities, right? Like with our own dreams.
Oh my gosh. Yes, to everything. I could just weep. Thank you. Yes, it's exactly that. And it's really helping me come to peace, even to just this aspect of my life that I've been working on now, where it's like I've been working for the past year and a half almost of really shifting my career away from being a marketer and being instead an artist, author, illustrator. And how actually Monday after this recording, I start work as a director of marketing. And and it's like, it's really helping me like come to peace even more with that decision, because I'm just seeing even, people in my world who are really pursuing the dream and who are really struggling with that physical safety at the same time. And that in and of itself can kill the dream, right? It will suck the joy out of it. I mean, for the past month or two, while I've been in the middle of making this huge decision and making this transition, it has been incredibly difficult to paint or draw. Like the creativity, the things that filled me have felt torturous. It hasn't felt good. And it's because a lot of that physical safety felt very threatened. And so I do think that this is where, to your point about like kind of buying into that, well, I've got physical safety. That's really all I need,
Right.
is like where I hope that everybody listening to this conversation walks away with kind of pushing those boundaries a little bit and just even asking yourself, okay, how can I maintain and or continue to create a situation where I have that physical safety, but also create and bring into my life more experiences that bring me that psychological wellness and liveliness that a dream could be doing. Because I think that sometimes we even like justify away doing those soulful things because we think it needs to be all consuming, or it needs to take, we would take weeks off or days off. And in my experience, I'm amazed at how even just taking 15 minutes to sit and draw something helps that psychological like stressor just melt away, and then I can manage the rest of my day. It's been amazing how little time actually sometimes is required, and how like sometimes we think, well, we haven't got the dream unless it's like I'm a famous artist and author, right? Which was like never what the little kid part of us wanted anyways. The little kid part of us, or the dreamer, just is like, wouldn't it be cool to paint and draw and make stories, and to be able to see like there's little ways to do those things every day, instead of this arrival point that, here again, actually I'm realizing as I'm saying this, is kind of still confusing it with physical safety of like, well, I can fully be the artist and the dream that I have once I am filthy rich, because then I'll have physical safety from the dream thing too, where I feel like there's this way instead we can straddle both worlds.
Well, and I think that's the thing that I take so much inspiration from you for, this idea of it. It can be like you can do both. You can be both. You can have this. It's not even duality, it's multiplicity, right? There can be all of these ways that we exist in the world, and we don't have to kill one or the other just for it to be. I think for a long time in my life, I do a lot of writing, right? A lot of writing, because in my professional life, I'm constantly writing papers for publications or white papers or articles or whatever. I write so much. And I've found that as part of doing that, the part of me that really likes to write poetry, or the part of me that writes for pleasure, kind of has like withered.
Yeah.
And I've had a hard time as I've gotten more and more, I want to say, like deep into academia and like this scientific field, in unlocking the parts of me that used to just exist. And so it's been such an inspiration to watch you really dedicate some time and space for this, and also to just advocate for its importance in the world. Like, it's been so freeing. I don't know that you told your listeners this, but for my birthday this year, everybody listening, I told Quinn that what I wanted was to do art in the park with her. And we went to the park and we sat on a hill, and we really didn't talk that much. And we just kind of did our own art. And it was one of the best birthday memories I think I have, because it was just this allowance for this piece of art and enjoyment to come out and exist in this space where I just was like, just doing this with my bestie, having a good time. So it was a good example of like letting yourself prioritize that, or fighting for it to be part of the dream and being willing to have that. So I appreciate that in the moment. And also I think it's such a great example of how we can try to have both things.
Oh, it is. I loved your birthday too. And I appreciate you bringing that up again, because I've thought a lot of times since how often I drive by that park. Is just drive by on the way to get somewhere or do something and blah, blah, blah. Life is moving so fast, right? And that day was part of what was so beautiful, is just carving out the time for it to be slow. And like, it's like we didn't paint masterpieces, and that we didn't post it to Instagram and it went viral and then we got a billion followers. Like, like it fed our souls because we literally just carved out time to be, to savor, to play a little bit and connect in a way that, you're right. Like, it was beautiful because we didn't need to sit and talk. We could just be there together. So you're inspiring me. I'm like thinking about, even just within our own relationship, how we can bring more of that into it, but also just like, how do we give ourselves more permission? I think like one of the things that I've been thinking of in going back to work, because this fear is very strong actually, of like, are we putting this dream in the dungeon by doing this, and this art dream. And I know like my like dear friend like you wouldn't let me, thank goodness. But also I've been seeing little ways where I'm thinking, okay, I could just build, like, I'll do some habit stacking where every time I'm eating lunch at my desk, I'll just have my sketchbook and I'll just do a little bit of a sketch while I'm eating lunch, a 15-minute sketch, or this will just be a part of when I'm eating breakfast too. And so I think that there are, like, that's what's feeling like in my next phase of life. Like, I've had the luxury over the past year and a half to be able to devote long hours of every day. And that's not always easier either. I actually have a feeling that I'm going to be a lot more creatively productive with less time, truthfully. I know that will sound ridiculous to a lot of listeners. But yeah, there's something about when we have to get more strategic that we sometimes get more things done,
There's, what's that poet's name? Elizabeth, oh gosh, I can't remember her name, but somebody once asked her why her poems were so short. And she said, because that's the number of lines that she's like, I have 5 kids. That's the number of lines I can carry in my head. And I think that, again, trying to live all of the lives is part of what makes modernity a challenge, but also super beautiful, because for the majority of people in the majority of history, your dreams were just stuff that, you didn't really get an opportunity to do.
Truthfully.
Yeah, true fantasy, right? And here we are with complexity that we're having to navigate, but opportunity to really find those spaces where this type of stuff can actually be created and fulfilled. And I think that's really, really miraculous. And I like that you're trying to figure out how to straddle both things. And I'm excited to watch and get inspiration from you.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. And thank you for cheering me on and for being on this episode. My goodness, we have been able to talk about so many good things. I would love, just in closing, if there's anything you'd love to make sure people walk away with, or you hope they walk away with, or just any last thoughts about the Bluebeard myth.
I think this is a dark myth, right? I think this is one that people feel is pretty grim, but I hope that listeners to this particular conversation will take from it this idea of how fruitful that darkness can be if you're willing to look at it and kind of not run away from it, to keep coming back to it and see what it can give you, because it's super rich, fertile space for your brain and your soul.
Oh my gosh. Thank you for that beautiful final note. I feel like I just want to add to that, I'm seeing this absolutely within anybody I've watched go through that bloody key phase in the darkness, is that you reclaim magic in those spaces if you don't run back to try to shut the door and ignore the whole thing never happened, right? But if you really face it and you really are coming to terms with it, something so rich and deep and beautiful is born in a person's soul and in their life in that space, like you're saying. So thank you for bringing that forward and just honoring the magic of that space. I think that Halloween and Samhain is always a really magical season anyways, where that veil between worlds is a lot thinner. It's a good opportunity to go into the dark and reclaim, exhume some of those bodies, those dreams, and reclaim some of that magic that maybe has been lost. So thank you so much, Rebecca. It's been such a joy to have you here. In Flow and On Fire is a weekly podcast to help you find your flow and stoke your inner fire so that you can live more joyfully, create those big and beautiful dreams, and make the world a better place. Living in Flow on Fire isn't a destination, it's a daily practice. We make this show every week to help support you in that practice with deep inspirational insights and real-world examples of other soulful people who are leaning into this journey also. To better support your In-Flow On Fire practice, we send you each week's episode via email direct to your inbox so you never miss a beat. Go to quincurtis.com/email to sign up and stay inspired. Also, when you sign up, you'll get access to my free Living in Flow and On Fire guide. A step-by-step path to find your flow and stoke your fire today. Sign up at quincurtis.com/email to amp up your inflow and on fire lifestyle with me now. This has been another episode of Inflow and On Fire, a weekly podcast cheering you on to follow your heart and come more alive. It can be tough to stay in flow and keep your creative fires burning bright, so please take this podcast with you on your journey. Subscribe so we can keep fanning your flames and cheering you on each week. If you got something out of this episode and haven't already left us a review, please do. Positive reviews really help other people who need this to find it also. I'm your host, Quinn Curtis, artist, mother of 5, and aspiring children's book author illustrator. I'm here creating this show because I know just how hard it can be to even just stay excited and engaged in our everyday lives. With so many demands for our time and attention, it can be especially tricky to prioritize those nudges from our heart and soul. However, the costs, like depression, disconnection, anxiety, overwhelm, loneliness, lack of fulfillment, and so much more, are really high when we don't. So every week I gather soulful stories, inspiring ideas, and incredible people to help us stay connected to our inner compass and remember what's most important. Ultimately, I created this show because I need those regular reminders too, but my hope is it can also inspire and help you to keep going and bring more of your magic that's inside of you out into the world. We need it. Special thanks to Avesa and Maddie Love for our theme music. Thank you so much for listening, friend. In between now and when we connect again, stay in flow on fire. It matters and you matter.